Imagine a bank vault. Inside sits over $200 billion in cash. It doesn't belong to the bank. It belongs to a very powerful and currently very angry client, the Russian state. Now, picture the leaders of Europe standing outside that vault. Ukraine is bleeding, and America has made it clear that its own wallet is closing. The temptation to just open the vault and use that money is immense. One leader, Denmark's prime minister, is practically urging everyone to pick the lock, calling it a fantastic idea. But another, the prime minister of Belgium, where most of this cash is actually held, is getting nervous. He's looking around at his colleagues and saying, hold on, if we do this, I want everyone to sign a piece of paper right now, promising that if this goes wrong, we all share the blame. Because they all know the owner of that money is watching. And he's already on the record calling this plan what it is in his eyes: theft, and promising that a boomerang is coming for anyone who touches his property.
That really paints the picture, doesn't it? The gravity is immense. We're way past standard sanctions now. This is about potentially grabbing sovereign assets. It's probably the single biggest financial and, frankly, legal puzzle Europe has faced in decades. It hits right at the core of how global finance works.
Exactly. And for you listening, our mission today is to really get under the hood of this. We're looking at Ukraine's absolutely desperate need for funds, these huge legal walls. The West keeps hitting, sovereign immunity, and also what Russia's already cooking up in response. They have detailed plans ready to go.
And let's just nail down the numbers again, because the scale here is key. We're talking about, give or take, $300 billion. That's billion with a B. Foreign exchange assets of the Russian central bank frozen right after the conflict kicked off.
Right. Freezing was one thing. Quick, decisive. Hit their capability.
Yes, it definitely restricted them. But now, figuring out the next step, moving from frozen to potentially confiscated, that's a whole different ballgame, massively complicated. It forces us to dig into the international law. Can you even use frozen state assets like this, especially with sovereign immunity looming over everything?
Okay, let's start there. Let's unpack the sheer scale of Ukraine's problem first, because that's what's driving this urgency, this push to get into that $300 billion vault, the damage figures, the funding gap. It's just eye-watering.
It really is catastrophic. You've got the World Bank, the EU, the UN. They put out their third assessment, the RDNA3 report, early 2024. And it's a pretty grim read.
So give us the headline number. What are we actually talking about in terms of reconstruction cost?
The big number for total recovery and reconstruction, and this isn't just quick fixes, we're talking a solid 10-year plan for rebuilding everything it stands at $486.3 billion. That was the estimate as of December 2023.
That's almost $500 billion.
$500 billion. Just to restore basic infrastructure, homes, services. It's hard to even comprehend that level of need.
And while all that damage was happening externally, internally, Ukraine's own budget just got completely warped by the war effort, right?
Yeah.
I saw figures showing their total spending basically doubled.
Absolutely doubled. Consolidated budget expenditure shot up from about 33.9% of their GDP back in 2021 to a massive 67.9% in 2023.
Wow. And what's driving that huge jump? Is it all military?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Defense spending. It went from being relatively small, maybe 2.3% of GDP in 2021, to dominating everything, 32.1% in 2023.
32%.
Think about that. Almost a third of their entire national economic output is going straight to the military. They're basically running a war economy, sacrificing almost everything else just to survive.
But that kind of spending leaves a massive hole, a persistent one. If you strip out the foreign aid, the grants, what does their internal budget deficit look like going forward? It must be huge.
It's alarming, and it's not going away quickly. The projections, even looking ahead, show a deficit of around 26.5% of GDP in 2025. It does come down gradually, but it's still projected at something like 15.3% even by 2028. There's just no way they can close that gap on their own.
Which really hammers home why they desperately need money from outside.
Yeah.
But not just any money, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned grants specifically.
Yes, critically, grants, not loans. If Ukraine takes on, say, $500 billion in new debt on top of everything else, their long-term financial stability just evaporates. It becomes completely unsustainable. And what's worrying is the trend, the share of grants they're receiving in foreign aid is actually falling.
Falling? How much?
It dropped pretty sharply. It was around 45.6% of their external financing back in 2022. But the estimate for 2024 is down to about 25%.
So wait a minute. Grants are essential for survival, but they're getting fewer of them? What does that imply long term?
Well, it implies potential disaster down the road. Experts are really sounding the alarm here. They calculate that for Ukraine's public debt to stay manageable, grants need to make up more than half, over 50% of any new foreign money coming in.
And if it doesn't?
If it doesn't, they risk winning the war only to face national bankruptcy. We've seen this before, historically. Post-conflict recovery works best with massive grant aid. Think about Bosnia and Herzegovina. Their recovery package was 82% grants.
And the big one, the Marshall Plan.
Exactly. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe after World War II, was over 90% grants or aid that didn't need to be repaid. Without that kind of grant-heavy support, Ukraine's financial future, even if the fighting stops tomorrow, looks incredibly precarious.
Okay. That absolutely sets the stage for why eyes are turning to that frozen $300 billion. The need is desperate, it's clear. But now, bang, we hit the wall. This legal fortress that seems to be keeping the vault locked, sovereign immunity.
This is the absolute crux of the legal problem. And it's why the Belgian Prime Minister, sitting on most of the cash, is so, let's say, cautious. Our current international legal system, particularly the bit grounded in the UN Charter's idea of sovereign equality, well, it generally says one country can't just seize the assets of another sovereign state held within its borders, especially not central bank reserves.
Why the special treatment for central bank reserves? Why aren't they like, say, assets of a state-owned company?
Because they serve a unique, purely sovereign function, managing money supply, keeping the currency stable, settling international trade. They aren't commercial assets used for profit. The thinking is, if you allow state A to just grab the core monetary assets of state B, you're fundamentally attacking state B's sovereignty. Its right to exist as an independent state, almost.
So even though Russia is the aggressor here, these old legal principles still shielded central banks' money.
Largely, yes. Historically, confiscating state assets like this really only happens in very specific, extreme situations. Usually after a formal declaration of war, maybe laid out in a peace treaty afterwards, or sometimes with regimes under total UN sanctions, like for terrorism. But the EU and US haven't declared war on Russia.
They've been careful not to.
Exactly. So trying to just seize the assets outright, it's pretty much unprecedented in this context. It arguably breaks rules that underpin the entire global financial system. That's why Germany's justice minister looked at the EU's early ideas and basically said, this is legally unworkable.
And the geography of where this money is sitting makes it a uniquely European headache, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Particularly for the euro currency itself.
Oh, absolutely. The concentration is the killer detail. Out of the total $300 billion frozen globally, the vast majority, over $200 billion, is held inside the EU. And the real pressure point, $196 billion of that, roughly $211 billion US dollars, is parked at one specific place, Euroclear, the big clearinghouse in Belgium.
And Euroclear isn't just a bank, it's like the central plumbing for European finance.
Precisely. It handles a massive chunk of all securities transactions in Europe. So having this huge pile of contested Russian money sitting right inside this critical piece of EU financial infrastructure, it terrifies the leaders of the core Eurozone countries, Belgium, France, Germany.
Because if they seize the principles...
If they seize the actual principle, they send a signal, a really dangerous signal to every other central bank manager in the world, especially in places like China, the Gulf states, India. The signal is, holding your national reserves in euros in our European systems isn't safe. It's politically risky. That could cause a massive flight from the euro, potentially destabilizing its status as a global reserve currency. It's an existential risk for them.
Right, so you've got this desperate need in Kyiv clashing with this legal paralysis and deep fear in Brussels and Berlin. And it seems the West has split into a couple of camps on how to break the deadlock. Let's look at the more aggressive idea first, direct seizure. Who's pushing for that?
Well, the main proponents there are the US, the UK, also Canada, Japan, and the Baltic states tend to be quite vocal. Their argument is pretty straightforward, almost moral. Russia caused the damage. The World Bank put a number on it, over $411 billion, so Russia should pay. Seizing the assets is seen as sort of financial justice.
And the U.S. actually passed a law to enable this, didn't they? The RPO Act.
They did, yes. Congress passed the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, REPO, back in April 2024. It explicitly gives the U.S. president the authority to confiscate Russian state assets that are held within the U.S.
Okay, this is where I get a bit confused. If the U.S. has the legal framework and the political will, why haven't they just done it? Why not seize the assets they hold?
Ah, that's the catch. It's about leverage and risk distribution. The U.S. actually holds only a tiny fraction of the total frozen Russian assets, probably less than $5 billion.
Only $5 billion out of 300.
Exactly. The vast bulk, the $200 billion plus, is sitting in Europe. So if the U.S. acted alone and seized its small share, it wouldn't make a huge difference to Ukraine financially, but it would likely trigger Russian retaliation against U.S. companies still in Russia. More importantly, it would put enormous pressure on the Europeans, who hold the real prize and face the biggest counter-retaliation risk, especially through Euroclear. The U.S. needs the G7 to act together.
So it's a standoff. The U.S., with less skin in the game financially, is pushing harder, while the EU, holding most of the risk, is hitting the brakes. You mentioned France, Germany, Belgium being particularly worried.
Deeply worried. It's an existential concern for them. As I said, Germany's justice minister called the initial EU seizure proposals legally unworkable. They fear two things equally: massive Russian retaliation against German and French companies still operating in Russia, and the potentially fatal blow to the euro's reputation as a safe global currency if they touch that principle. The idea that assets aren't truly safe from political seizure, that's terrifying for them.
Okay, so if outright confiscation is effectively blocked by European caution, the conversation had to shift. What were the backup plans? The intermediate options that try to get money flowing without actually seizing the core assets. Let's talk option A. Just taking the profits or the interest.
Right. This was the first sort of compromise idea. Since the $300 billion principle seemed untouchable because of sovereign immunity, the focus shifted. Okay, the money's frozen, but it's still invested somewhere, presumably earning interest or profits, right? Especially the huge chunk sitting at Euroclear.
Is it generating much?
Surprisingly, yes. Euroclear itself reported making over $1.7 billion in profit just from handling these frozen Russian assets in the first half of 2023 alone.
Wow, that's a lot of money generated by assets that aren't technically theirs.
Exactly. And Belgium saw an opportunity there. They moved quite quickly to put a special tax on those windfall profits generated within their jurisdiction. They used that tax revenue to fund an initial $92 million aid package for Ukraine. Later, they pledged a much larger $1.7 billion, specifically from the 2023 tax haul on those profits.
And the legal argument is slightly different for the profits versus the principal.
It's a bit fuzzier, but yeah. The argument is that the profits were generated within the EU by an EU institution, Euroclear, from assets held there. So maybe those profits are less protected by sovereign immunity than the original Russian state principle. It's a bit of a legal workaround.
Okay, that sounds cleaner, less risky.
Yeah.
Ukraine gets some cash. Europe avoids the massive legal fight over the principle. What's the problem with just doing that?
The problem is simple. Scale. It's just not enough money. While $3 to $5 billion a year, that's the rough estimate of what this profit skimming could generate annually. Sounds like a lot.
It sounds like a lot.
It is, but compare it to Ukraine's need. That $486 billion reconstruction bill we talked about.
Yeah.
If you're only getting $3 to $5 billion a year, it would take, well, somewhere between 90 and 120 years to cover the full cost.
A century.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not a solution.
It provides some helpful short-term cash, absolutely. But it doesn't solve the fundamental, massive, long-term funding gap Ukraine faces. It's a Band-Aid, not a cure.
Which logically brings us to option B. This seems to be the current favorite, the one gaining traction, designed specifically to bridge that scale gap. The collateralized loan, the G7 plan.
Exactly. This is the really clever, maybe slightly convoluted workaround. It's designed to get a large chunk of money to Ukraine now without technically seizing the Russian assets yet. The basic idea, strongly pushed by the U.S. but also supported now by Belgium's PM, is for the G7 countries to set up a special fund or mechanism.
Okay.
This mechanism would then issue bonds or arrange loans, probably raising around $50 billion initially, and give that money directly to Ukraine.
50 billion, that's a much bigger number. But how is it secured? What does collateralized actually mean when the collateral is frozen Russian money you can't legally touch?
That's the clever bit. The loans aren't collateralized by the $300 billion principal itself. They're collateralized by the expected future profits and interest that the frozen principal will generate over many years.
Wait, say that again? Future interest.
Yes. The G7 essentially says, we'll borrow $50 billion today and give it to Ukraine. We promise the lenders will pay them back over the next, say, 20, 30, maybe even 50 years, using the stream of interest income that the frozen $300 billion Russian principal keeps generating while it sits there.
So the G7 takes out a huge loan now, gives the cash to Ukraine, and the repayment plan relies entirely on interest payments accruing from Russia's own frozen money potentially for decades.
That's the core structure. It gets cash to Ukraine immediately for budget support and recovery. The Russian assets themselves, they remain officially frozen, technically still Russian property. But here's the political lock. The G7 nations have to agree amongst themselves that these assets will stay frozen and the interest will keep flowing to repay the loan until one of two things happens.
Okay, what are the two things?
Either Russia agrees to pay full compensation to Ukraine for war damages, or the $50 billion loan is fully paid off by the accumulated interest over time.
That's a massive long-term commitment. What happens if, say, 15 years down the line, there's some kind of peace deal, Russia refuses to pay compensation, but there's still, I don't know, $20 billion left on this G7 loan? Who pays then?
No.
Does the G7 just seize the principal at that point?
That's the implicit threat and the ultimate risk the G7 takes on collectively. The expectation, or perhaps the gamble, is that if Russia never agrees to pay compensation, then yes, the G7 would eventually be forced to move from freezing to outright confiscation of the principal to settle the outstanding debt.
So it forces Russia to, in effect, pay the interest on this loan it completely rejects, or face losing the principal permanently later on.
Exactly. It's a way to make Russia pay indirectly now via the interest, while delaying the legally explosive act of confiscation. It sort of kicks the final decision down the road, gets Ukraine urgent help, and maximizes financial pressure on Russia without crossing that final legal red line immediately.
Okay, the G7 loan structure sounds financially quite elegant, maybe legally clever, but it's still designed to punish Russia. And Russia isn't just going to sit back and watch this happen, are they? They've been very clear about retaliation, this boomerang threat.
Oh, the threat is absolutely credible, and they've been hammering this point relentlessly. President Putin himself called the initial freezing medieval robbery. His spokesperson consistently labels these plans illegal confiscation and plain theft. That kind of language isn't accidental. It's signaling that any move the G7 makes will be met with a proportional or maybe even disproportional response.
And they've already put the legal machinery in place for this response, targeting Western companies still inside Russia. Tell us about the decree.
Yes, they prepared the ground legally. Putin signed a specific decree. It explicitly authorizes the Russian state to nationalize or force the fast-track sale of foreign assets still remaining within Russia. And the decree frames this explicitly as compensation for losses Russia suffers from Western sanctions or asset seizures. It basically gives them the legal green light for revenge seizures.
Fast-track sale. What does that actually mean for, say, a German car manufacturer or a French retailer that maybe paused operations but still technically owns a factory or stores in Russia?
It means they could lose them very, very quickly with little recourse. The decree is designed to speed everything up dramatically. It limits the time allowed for valuing an asset before sale to just 10 days. It cuts through the usual red tape for changing ownership records. They even designated a specific state-owned bank, Bank, to handle these rapid transactions, basically putting assets under temporary Russian state control almost overnight.
It sounds engineered for maximum disruption and financial pain for Western investors. Now, Russia throws around a big number for the value of assets they could seize and return up to $500 billion. Is that realistic, or is it just Kremlin posturing?
It's likely a mix of both, but the potential is certainly there. It's not just financial assets, it's heavily weighted towards physical things. Russia claims the total value of assets belonging to companies from unfriendly countries, assets that are either frozen by Russian counter-sanctions or still operating but vulnerable, could indeed reach $500 billion.
What kind of assets are we talking about?
Think manufacturing plants, like the car factories, real estate holdings, crucially, significant stakes in joint ventures, especially in the energy sector, oil and gas projects, and also in finance. These are valuable, tangible assets.
So the boomerang threat is essentially if the G7 goes ahead with this $50 billion loan backed by our $300 billion, we have the legal means ready to seize maybe $500 billion worth of your company's assets inside Russia, making the West the net loser.
That's the core of the deterrent strategy. It's leverage. They're saying, take our money and we'll take even more of yours. And we've already seen them start to pull the trigger on this, demonstrating they're serious. It's not just talk.
Right. Give us some concrete examples. Where have they actually started freezing Western assets in retaliation?
They've gone after financial institutions directly. A court in St. Petersburg ordered a freeze on about $440 million worth of assets belonging to JP Morgan Chase in Russia. That hits a major U.S. bank.
Okay.
Perhaps even more pointedly, given the Euroclear situation, they've also frozen assets belonging to European clearinghouses that are located within Russia. Specifically, they froze 229.1 billion rubles, that's about 2.7 billion US dollars worth of Euroclear's own assets held in Russia.
So they're hitting Euroclear directly, the very institution holding most of their frozen funds in Europe. And that frozen money in Russia becomes a bargaining chip.
Precisely. It's direct leverage. Russia is now saying to EU investors who have their assets frozen in Russia, look, we'll let you use these frozen Euroclear funds that we've now frozen to buy back your Russian assets. It's an attempt to create a complicated swap, bypassing Western financial channels and trying to pressure European regulators by holding their clearinghouses' assets hostage in a way.
Beyond these direct tit-for-tat freezes, the initial asset freeze back in 2022 seems to have had a much bigger, longer-term effect. It basically forced Russia to accelerate plans to become less reliant on the Western financial system altogether.
That's arguably the most profound, lasting consequence of this whole affair. The freeze acted as a massive catalyst. It spurred huge strategic shifts inside Russia's financial thinking. We saw it immediately with the ruble payment order.
Right, where they demanded gas payments in rubles.
Exactly. They forced countries they designated as unfriendly to pay for natural gas in rubles. And frankly, it worked surprisingly well. It stabilized the ruble's exchange rate at a critical moment when the West expected sanctions to cause a currency collapse.
And what about the broader use of dollars and euros for trade? Has that changed significantly?
Dramatically. And it looks permanent. Russia has consciously, aggressively reduced its reliance on the US dollar and the euro for settling foreign trade. Before the conflict, those two currencies probably handled around 90% of their trade settlements.
90%.
And now?
Now, it's plummeted. Recent figures suggest dollars and euros combined account for only about 33% of their export settlements and maybe 35% of import settlements.
That's a massive shift away from the traditional reserve currencies.
Yeah.
Where is that trade settlement volume moving to? What are they using instead?
They're actively moving towards currencies of countries they see as non-hostile, primarily the Chinese yuan, the RMB. And also, significantly, they're shifting their own national reserves away from what they now openly call toxic currencies, the dollar and euro, and putting that wealth into two main things, Chinese yuan and physical gold.
Gold. We've heard a lot about central banks buying gold recently. Is Russia a big part of that?
A very significant part. And this Russian pivot is feeding into and amplifying a much bigger global trend. Some people are calling it the remonetization of gold. Central banks all around the world watching how the dollar and euro systems were just weaponized against a major power like Russia. Well, they got nervous. They collectively bought over 800 tons of gold in 2023 alone.
800 tons. Who else is buying besides Russia?
China is a huge buyer. India, Turkey, various central banks in the Middle East and Asia. They're all seeking a store of value that isn't controlled by another sovereign state, isn't vulnerable to sanctions in the same way. It reflects a deep, perhaps permanent erosion of trust in the safety and neutrality of holding reserves in Western fiat currencies.
Okay, so we've got this immense need in Ukraine, this complex and risky G7 loan plan potentially coming, and Russia's very real counter threats. But for Ukraine to actually absorb and effectively use any massive inflow of funds, whether it's loans, grants, or maybe one day seized assets they need to have their own house in order, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening with their internal budget management during all this?
Well, the reality is that funding the war effort has forced incredibly painful choices domestically. To pour money into defense, they've had to make deep cuts elsewhere, often in areas crucial for long-term recovery and development.
Like what areas?
Education is a big one. Spending on education dropped from about 5.7% of GDP pre-war down to 4.6% projected for 2024. Spending categorized under economic activity, things like infrastructure support, business development, that's been slashed even more dramatically from 5.4% of GDP down to just 2% in 2024.
Gutted, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And cutting these long-term investments in people and the economy, it obviously raises big questions about how quickly Ukraine can genuinely recover economically, even after the fighting stops.
So logically, any big reconstruction package, like the EU's proposed Ukraine facility, must come with strings attached, conditions demanding serious public finance reforms.
Absolutely essential. The reconstruction plans are explicitly tied to deep, sometimes politically very difficult reforms, Ukraine needs to get back to proper medium-term budget planning, for starters. They need massive improvements in transparency and anti-corruption measures to assure donors the money won't be wasted. And a huge piece of this is implementing what they call a national revenue strategy, the NRS.
National revenue strategy. What does that involve? Is it just about raising taxes?
It's broader than just tax hikes, but yes, boosting government revenue is key. It aims to fundamentally modernize their tax system and bring it more in line with EU standards. It's a condition for long-term support.
What kind of specific measures are we talking about under this NRS?
Yeah.
Because raising taxes during a war must be incredibly unpopular.
It's extremely sensitive, no doubt, but necessary if they want deeper EU integration and the funding that comes with it. The strategy includes things like potentially controversial military levies, special taxes earmarked just for defense. It also means aligning their excise taxes on things like alcohol, tobacco, fuel, with the minimum levels required in the EU.
Okay.
Plus, reforming the simplified tax systems often used by small businesses, which can sometimes facilitate avoidance. And crucially, really cracking down on corporate tax evasion and improving compliance. These are tough steps, politically costly, but they're seen as non-negotiable by Western partners providing the big money.
Let's look at where that reconstruction money is supposed to go, assuming it arrives. That $486 billion need, where are the biggest spending pressures expected in the next few years, outside the military budget?
Well, looking at the medium-term projections, say from 2025 out to 2028, the needs are heavily concentrated in rebuilding the absolute foundations of society and the economy. The single biggest area is social protection and livelihood.
What does that cover?
That's supporting displaced people, pensions, basic income support, dealing with the massive humanitarian fallout. That alone is projected to need something like 8.5% to 9% of GDP every year.
Huge. What else?
Transport infrastructure is another massive cost center. Rebuilding roads, railways, bridges, that's estimated at 4.0% to 4.5% of GDP annually. And education, despite those recent cuts we mentioned, rebuilding schools and universities is still projected to require 6.1% to 6.2% of GDP each year just to catch up.
Okay, so you've got these massive needs, the requirement for deep internal reforms. How does this all tie into Ukraine's ultimate strategic goal, joining the European Union? If the Russian asset money isn't a silver bullet, and traditional aid might be shaky, how can the EU structure its long-term support to keep Ukraine stable and incentivize these reforms needed for membership?
This is where some really interesting thinking is happening, particularly in Brussels policy circles, places like CEPS and CEP. They're arguing that the traditional EU accession process, the way countries usually join, is just too slow, too cumbersome, and frankly, too politically uncertain for a country in Ukraine's position.
Why too slow? What's wrong with the old model?
The classic path takes many, many years. It involves ticking off thousands of legislative boxes across dozens of chapters. It's vulnerable to vetoes by any single existing member state at multiple points. And crucially, the really big financial rewards, like access to the EU's huge structural and cohesion funds, they only really kick in right at the very end, once you become a full member.
Which could be a decade or more away.
Easily. So the incentive structure is weak in the short to medium term, when Ukraine needs the most help and the most encouragement to reform.
So what's the alternative being proposed? How can they speed things up and, importantly, unlock serious funding much sooner?
It's called the staged accession model. The idea is to break down the huge task of joining the EU into more manageable stages, maybe 4 distinct stages. Progress from one stage to the next would be based on meeting clear, objective benchmarks, especially in crucial areas like rule of law, democratic institutions, market reforms.
Okay, staged progress. But what's the big advantage? How does that help with funding?
Here's the key innovation: linking financial rewards directly to progress through the stages. Instead of waiting until full membership under this model, Ukraine could start accessing a percentage of the EU's main funding streams, particularly the cohesion policy funds used for regional development, much, much earlier.
And much earlier, and how much money?
The proposals vary slightly, but the core idea is something like this. Reach stage I successfully, you get access to, say, 40% of the funding a normal member state of your size would receive. Make it to stage 2, that bumps up to maybe 60%. Reach stage 3. You could transition to getting the full 100% level of funding before you've actually crossed the final threshold to become a full political member with voting rights, etc.
Wow, okay. That fundamentally changes the incentive structure. You get rewarded financially substantially for making progress on reforms along the way.
Exactly. It turns the EU's reconstruction funding into a powerful, continuous incentive mechanism. If Ukraine makes tangible progress on fighting corruption, strengthening its judiciary, aligning its economic rules with the EU, boom, they unlock the next tranche of serious development funding.
So the money isn't just aid, it's leverage for reform.
Precisely. It ensures the reconstruction funds serve a dual purpose: rebuilding the country physically, while also driving the deep institutional reforms needed for long-term stability and eventual EU membership. It makes the process more merit-based, less prone to political blockages, and delivers tangible benefits much faster. It also helps manage the politics by showing clear, earned progress rather than just fast-tracking membership itself.
So when you step back and look at everything we've discussed today, this whole saga around the $300 billion vault, the proposed $50 billion loan, Russia's $500 billion counter threat, it feels like more than just a financial dispute, doesn't it? It feels much bigger.
It absolutely is bigger. The decision by Western powers, first to freeze and now to seriously debate confiscating the sovereign reserves of a major global power like Russia. It's not just another economic sanction. It's something fundamentally different. It's the deliberate weaponization of the entire global financial infrastructure.
Weaponization. You mean targeting the core systems themselves?
Yes. Targeting the very foundations. The clearing systems, like Euroclear, that act as the neutral plumbing, and targeting the fundamental trust that nations place in the major reserve currencies, the dollar and the euro, believing them to be stable, neutral stores of value. When you start using those core components as political weapons,
You damage them permanently.
you inevitably erode global trust. You send a message to every other country holding significant reserves, think China, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, that your assets held in Western systems are only truly safe as long as your politics align perfectly with Washington or Brussels.
And that realization, that loss of trust, must be driving some of the shifts we talked about earlier.
Without a doubt. This massive political and legal fight over the $300 billion has dramatically accelerated trends that were already underway. The push for de-dollarization in international trade, the urgent search by central banks for diversification away from the dollar and euro, and that very visible trend we discussed, central banks piling back into physical gold as a non-political, non-weaponizable asset.
So regardless of how this specific G7 loan plays out, whether it succeeds or fails or gets bogged down, the larger impact is already here.
I think so. This confrontation, this willingness to cross the Rubicon of seizing sovereign assets, has marked a clear and probably irreversible turning point. It has fundamentally shaken the foundations of the post-World War II global economic order, and we're only just beginning to see the long-term consequences unfold.